The week of May 21 through May 28, 2026 did not begin with a single explosion or a single headline. It began the way the most consequential weeks in military history always begin. Quietly, with radar operators leaning closer to their screens, with sonar operators pressing their headsets tighter to their ears, with intelligence analysts circling timestamps on satellite imagery that didn't quite match the pattern from the day before, and with commanding officers in 3 separate theaters on 3 separate continents giving the same clipped instruction to the same category of subordinate: track it, log it, do not lose it. The world this week was not at peace in any meaningful sense of that word, but it was not yet in the kind of open, declared, full-spectrum warfare that ends governments and redraws borders in a single month. And that narrow corridor between sustained conflict and catastrophic escalation was precisely where every military player operated during these 7 days, threading decisions through windows that were measured in seconds and kilometers, making judgment calls that would be studied in war colleges for decades, and doing it all under the compound pressure of 3 simultaneous crises that each on its own would have qualified as the defining military story of any ordinary year. There was no ordinary year anymore. There was only this week, these fronts, these choices, and the men and machines trying to hold the line. In eastern Ukraine, on the Pokrovsk front that had been grinding for months through the lunar gray rubble of Donetsk Oblast, the week produced a number that should be read slowly and let to settle before moving on. 256 combat engagements in a single day, May 27th, with nearly 50 of those concentrated in the Pokrovsk sector alone, a sector where Russian forces had been pressing with the kind of attritional persistence that does not make dramatic headlines, but does make territory, slowly and at enormous human cost, one contested tree line and one shattered apartment block at a time. The Ukrainian General Staff reported that figure without drama, as they had been reporting similar figures for weeks, because on this front, the extraordinary had become ordinary, and the machinery of war had achieved a kind of terrible rhythmic efficiency that processed hundreds of violent engagements per day the way an industrial plant processes raw material, continuously, without pause, without sentiment. Russia launched 124 drones toward Ukraine overnight on May 22, and then on May 17 alone, they unleashed 75 airstrikes and deployed 2,960 kamikaze drones and executed 4,735 attacks, including 122 from multiple launch rocket systems, numbers that require a moment's pause to absorb, because they describe not a battle, but an atmosphere, a sustained nationwide mechanized pressure campaign designed to exhaust Ukrainian air defense inventories, demoralize civilian populations, and erode the forward combat capacity of Ukrainian ground forces simultaneously. The Russian logic was not subtle. If you cannot break the army at the front, you break the country behind it, and you do it with drones that cost far less than the missiles Ukraine must spend to destroy them, creating an exchange ratio that grinds down the defender even when every individual intercept is successfully executed. But Ukraine was not simply absorbing. The week of May 21 saw Ukrainian forces advance in Sumy Oblast, in the Borova direction, in the Slavyansk direction, in the Pokrovsk direction itself, and in western Zaporizhia Oblast. Those advances measured not in kilometers, but in hundreds of meters, in villages taken back or positions improved, in fire control of ridgelines that allowed artillery to reach supply routes they had not reached the week before. The mid-range strike campaign, the FP-1 and FP-2 drone operations that had been accumulating since January, hit its stride this week, with Ukrainian forces striking occupied Starobilsk in Luhansk Oblast overnight on May 21 to 22, striking a Russian OSA air defense system in occupied Donetsk city, destroying a command and observation post in occupied Novopetrokivka, roughly 40 kilometers from the front line, and hitting drone command infrastructure that Russian forces had quietly positioned in rear areas, believing those areas were beyond reach, a belief that was being systematically disproven week by week. By April alone, Ukraine had conducted 450 successful strikes on Russia and occupied territories, and since January, the mid-range drone campaign had executed nearly 600 strikes into occupied territory, a tempo that began reshaping the tactical mathematics of the Eastern Front in ways that would take months to fully manifest, but were already visible in Russian logistics patterns, in the forced repositioning of supply nodes further from the front, in the increased costs and reduced reliability of fuel and ammunition delivery to Russian assault units trying to sustain pressure on Pokrovsk and the Konstantinivka axis. The General Staff reported on May 22 that Ukrainian forces had struck Russian personnel concentrations in Seladov, roughly 21 kilometers from the front line, and in Ukranka, roughly 17 kilometers out, and in the area of Pokrovsk itself, strikes designed not just to kill soldiers, but to destroy the command coherence of Russian assault formations that had been staging and rotating through those areas under the assumption that depth provided safety. That assumption, like so many Russian assumptions in this war, was being steadily invalidated. The total Russian combat losses since the beginning of the full-scale invasion now stood at approximately 1,358,950 personnel as of May 27th, a figure that incorporated the latest daily report of 1,000 troops killed in a single day. Losses that Russia was absorbing through conscription, contract recruitment, and reported pressure on Belarus President Alexander Lukashenko to open a new northern axis through Chernihiv, a pressure campaign Zelensky addressed publicly on May 15th, when he disclosed that Russia was actively lobbying Lukashenko to commit Belarusian forces to simultaneous operations from Bryansk towards Chernihiv, in what would have been an attempt to recreate the multi-axis pressure of the February 2022. Opening, stretching Ukrainian defensive depth and forcing reallocation of reserves that were currently stabilizing the Pokrovsk sector. Ukraine reinforced its northern border in response, and Zelensky stated with characteristic directness that consequences for any Belarusian participation would follow and would be significant, a warning delivered not just to Minsk, but to Moscow, which understood that pulling Belarus into the war would change NATO's calculus in ways that even the most hawkish Russian planners had not fully prepared for. Simultaneously, in the middle of this grinding Eastern Front reality, Ukraine executed one of the most striking strategic operations of the war's fourth year. On May 17, a series of Ukrainian drone and missile strikes targeted military-industrial complexes within a 100-kilometer radius of Moscow, a direct and deliberate response to the massive Russian aerial attacks on Kyiv on May 13 and 14 that had killed 52 people in the capital, including civilians in residential areas, and which Zelensky had promised would not go unanswered. The week's developments on the Ukrainian front, taken together, described a conflict that had entered a phase of mutual deep strike, where both sides possessed the reach to threaten the other's rear areas, infrastructure, and civilian confidence simultaneously, and where the front line itself had become simultaneously the most important and the least decisive geography of the war, because the war was now being fought everywhere at once, at the front in hundreds of daily engagements, in the skies over Ukrainian cities, in Russian oil terminals and military plants, and in the information environment where both sides competed to shape the interpretation of events that neither side could fully control. Across the world, in a theater geographically removed but strategically interconnected through energy markets and great power competition, the Strait of Hormuz entered its most delicate phase since the crisis began on February 28, 2026, when the United States and Israel launched the strikes against Iran that killed Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei and initiated the most significant Middle East military confrontation in a generation. That conflict, which had burned intensely through March and early April, had achieved a ceasefire on April 8, brokered by Pakistan in one of the most consequential diplomatic interventions in recent memory. A 2-week pause in hostilities that Islamabad had secured through a combination of geographic positioning, Islamic credibility, and a calculated willingness to absorb the diplomatic risk of mediating between Washington and Tehran at a moment when both sides were simultaneously exhausted and undefeated. The ceasefire had held, more or less, through repeated tests, but the week of May 25 to 28 produced the most dangerous test yet. On May 25, the U.S. military conducted what CENTCOM described as self-defense strikes, targeting Iranian missile launch sites and boats around the strait, a decision that was explained by CENTCOM spokesman Timothy Hawkins as protection of U.S. troops from threats posed by Iranian forces, but which Tehran characterized as evidence of American deceit and treachery, while simultaneously continuing the diplomatic negotiations in Doha that had been described by Iranian outlet Tasnim as having gone generally positive the same day. This was the peculiar and precarious reality of the Hormuz situation in the final week of May, strikes and negotiations running simultaneously, each side firing and talking at the same time, each side threatening escalation while advancing towards a framework that both sides had acknowledged was largely negotiated. President Trump said publicly on May 23 that a deal had been largely negotiated, subject to finalization, between the United States, the Islamic Republic of Iran, and various other countries, a characterization that sent oil prices falling and global stock markets rising before Trump himself cautioned that a deal was not even fully negotiated yet, a verbal reversal that summarized the entire character of this diplomatic process, which had been proceeding in fits and starts for weeks, with language disputes, framework disagreements, and competing domestic political pressures on both sides, making every step forward contingent on not losing ground on three other points simultaneously. The proposed Memorandum of Understanding was generating specific sticking points that illuminated the structural gap between what each side needed to tell their own people. Washington insisted that the unfreezing of $24 billion in Iranian assets stored in banks overseas would occur only after the Strait of Hormuz was reopened, while Tehran demanded that the draft language reflect a commitment to the withdrawal of U.S. forces, a demand Washington characterized as a fabrication of what the draft actually said, a dispute over language that was not merely semantic but foundational, because the words a government puts in a ceasefire agreement are what its domestic audience judges it by. And both Tehran's new leadership under Khamenei's successor and Washington's political coalition had domestic audiences that needed the agreement to look like victory rather than accommodation. The strait itself remained effectively closed to commercial shipping, with vessel transits at roughly 5% of pre-conflict levels, a closure that had pushed global oil and gas prices to crisis levels, forced several Arab states to cut or suspend oil production due to Iranian attack threats, and created a global fuel crisis whose ripple effects were being felt from Asian manufacturing centers to European heating markets to the inflation statistics that were measuring American household economic pain in real time. The IRGC had claimed that 25 vessels transited Hormuz during one recent day, an assertion that was part of a pattern of Iranian public messaging designed to suggest that normal operations were resuming, even as the strait's actual commercial function remained severely degraded. The naval dimension of the Hormuz crisis during this week involved a sustained and dangerous dance between U.S. carrier strike group assets and Iranian forces operating in and around the strait, a dance that continued to test the boundaries of the ceasefire framework in ways that the framework itself had not anticipated clearly enough to prevent. U.S. forces conducting self-defense strikes on the 25th were responding to what CENTCOM described as direct threats, but the line between a threat that justifies a preemptive self-defense strike and an Iranian military posture that falls within what a ceasefire framework permits was exactly the kind of ambiguous threshold that wars often cross not because anyone decided to cross it, but because the definition of the threshold itself was contested by both parties simultaneously. The energy markets were watching every development because the strait carried approximately 20% of global petroleum and 20% of the world's liquefied natural gas, numbers that translated directly into European heating costs, Asian industrial energy bills, and the fuel price component of inflation indexes that were shaping political futures in half a dozen democracies at once. The 60-day ceasefire extension framework that the Washington Post reported had been developed as of May 25th, under which the strait would be demined and reopened while final deal talks continued, represented the most substantive diplomatic progress of the crisis. But it was progress that had not yet been formalized, had not yet been signed, and was being simultaneously described as largely done and not yet fully negotiated by the same American president within the span of days, creating a volatility in market expectations relations and diplomatic confidence that made every naval incident in the strait read as potentially the incident that collapsed the framework and reignited the conflict. The military situation in the strait as of May 28th thus had the character of a pressure cooker whose release valve was partially open but whose temperature had not yet fully dropped, and where the behavior of individual commanders on both sides making tactical decisions in real time without complete information about what their diplomatic teams had agreed or were agreeing to in Doha created a structural risk of miscalculation that no framework language could fully eliminate. Meanwhile, 1 year and approximately 2 weeks after one of the most serious military confrontations between nuclear-armed states since the Cold War, the India-Pakistan ceasefire that had been achieved on May 10, 2025, following India's Operation Sindoor strikes on terrorist camps in Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir, was holding, but holding with the specific and uneasy quality of something that could become unheld at any moment, as a Washington Post analysis on May 5, 2026, described with the analogy of two people who once threw furniture at each other being technically peaceful roommates. A description that captured the structural fragility of a ceasefire between two nuclear states with unresolved territorial disputes, mutual mistrust, and domestic political audiences that both governments had primed for confrontation over decades of conflict narrative. Operation Sindoor, the 88-hour Indian combined arms assault on terrorist training camps in Pakistan and Pakistan-administered Kashmir on the night of May 6 to 7, 2025, had been the kinetic response to the April 22, 2025 Pahalgam attack on Hindu tourists that New Delhi had blamed on Pakistani-supported militants and the subsequent 4 days of back-and-forth strikes in which Pakistan claimed it downed 5 Indian jets, including Rafales. India acknowledged some losses while denying 6 aircraft, and both sides used fighter jets, missiles, artillery, and drones across the line of control, had brought 2 nuclear-armed states to the edge of a conflict that would have threatened 1 billion lives and potentially triggered exchanges that the world's nuclear deterrence architecture had been designed to prevent, but could not guarantee would prevent, under conditions of intense escalatory pressure on both sides simultaneously. The energy markets were watching every development because Pakistan was credited in international circles for its mediation of the U.S.-Iran ceasefire in April 2026, a diplomatic role that had elevated Islamabad's international profile considerably and that Pakistani officials had worked assiduously to leverage into broader legitimacy. Even as domestically, the country's military under General Asem Munir continued to reassert control in ways that drew comparisons to the Zia era, and even as India's military leadership was issuing pointed statements about not showing restraint in any future conflict, with Indian Army Chief Gen Dwivedi stating that Indian forces would not show any restraint this time, and Indian Air Force Chief Amar Preet Singh claiming credit for downing 5 Pakistani jets during the May 2025 conflict, all of which contributed to a bilateral atmosphere where any single incident along the line of control could trigger the downfall of a ceasefire that an international community and military experts agreed was at best structurally fragile, remaining a ceasefire that represented the single most diplomatic achievement of the near conflict between India and Pakistan in May 2025, a diplomatic achievement that was more serious than any contemporary conflict between nuclear-armed states since the initial challenge to the global nuclear order between India and Pakistan in the 1990s, and a diplomatic achievement that had consumed political bandwidth within the Pakistani establishment that was attempting to mediate a second ceasefire between the U.S. and Iran at the same time, a pressure cooker that had been released partially but whose temperature had not yet fully dropped, and where the behavior of individual commanders on both sides making tactical decisions in real time without complete information about what their diplomatic teams had agreed or were agreeing to in Doha created a structural risk of miscalculation that no framework language could fully eliminate.
Which the ceasefire was a fact on paper, but a continuously contested reality on the ground along the line of control. The week of May 21 to 28, 2026 did not produce a new India-Pakistan incident, but it took place within a strategic environment shaped by the knowledge that the last incident had occurred a year ago between states that each possessed nuclear weapons and that each had demonstrated both the capacity and the political will to use conventional military force against the other at scale and with speed, and that the mechanisms for preventing the next escalation were exactly as strong and exactly as fragile as they had been before the last one began. In the South China Sea and the Western Pacific, the larger strategic competition between the United States and China, which provided the backdrop against which all of these individual conflicts acquired their systemic significance, continued to express itself through the accumulated weight of naval positioning, electronic surveillance, air patrol patterns, and the kind of constant low-intensity friction that does not produce daily headlines, but does produce the condition of continuous readiness that defines great power military competition in an era where neither side wants a war both sides are preparing for. The Iran conflict's disruption of Strait of Hormuz shipping had accelerated the rerouting of energy and commercial traffic in ways that stressed Pacific and Indian Ocean naval disposition planning, with U.S. carrier strike groups managing multiple simultaneous commitments in the Persian Gulf context while maintaining their traditional presence in the Western Pacific, a demand on force structure that was being managed through scheduling adjustments and extended deployments rather than permanent increases in ship count, creating a readiness and fatigue dynamic that defense planners were tracking with growing concern but had not yet identified as a crisis point. The broader arc of the week's military events, taken together and viewed from altitude, described a world in which the architecture of post-Cold War stability, built on assumptions about the containment of regional conflict, the reliability of nuclear deterrence as a backstop, and the capacity of great power diplomacy to manage crises before they became catastrophes, was being tested simultaneously on multiple axes by actors who had independently concluded, for their own separate reasons, that the cost of inaction or accommodation exceeded the risk of military action, a convergence of aggressive judgment calls that had produced in the space of roughly 15 months a hot war in Ukraine entering its 5th year, a U.S.-Israeli war against Iran that had killed Iran's supreme leader and closed the world's most important oil choke point, a nuclear-armed confrontation between India and Pakistan that had required direct great power intervention to prevent from becoming an exchange, and a continuous low-level tension in the Pacific that had not yet produced a major incident, but that structured every other conflict by establishing what the ultimate escalation risks were if smaller conflicts expanded. The men and women managing these crises this week, in CICs aboard carrier strike groups in the Persian Gulf, in artillery positions along the Pokrovsk front, where 256 engagements were counted in a single day, in diplomatic back channels in Doha and in Islamabad, and in quiet rooms in Washington and in Tehran, where people who had been shooting at each other's soldiers 3 months ago were trying to find language they could both live with. All of them were working with the same fundamental constraint that has always governed the management of military conflict at the edge of catastrophe, which is the constraint of imperfect information, of adversaries whose intentions are legible only through the uncertain medium of their actions, of domestic political pressures that make the rational choice for both sides simultaneously and contradictorily impossible, and of time pressures that compress decisions that should take days into windows that last minutes. Ukraine's drone operators, who struck within 100 kilometers of Moscow on May 17th, knew they were crossing a threshold that Russia had previously treated as red, and they crossed it anyway, because 52 people had died in Kyiv in the previous days, and because the logic of their war had become a logic of symmetrical reach, where the price of being reachable was that you became reaching, and where the alternative to striking was absorbing, and absorbing without striking back had been demonstrated over 4 years of this conflict to be a losing proposition militarily and politically. The U.S. commanders who authorized self-defense strikes in the Strait of Hormuz on May 25th knew they were firing during a ceasefire, and they did it anyway because the threat to their forces was real and the framework's ambiguity left them latitude, and because the alternative to responding was signaling that Iranian forces could threaten American troops without consequence, which is a signal no American military commander is structurally capable of sending. The Pokrovsk front's 256 engagements on May 27th were not a spike, they were the baseline, the number that the week treated as normal, a normalization of mass violence at industrial scale that no weekly summary can fully communicate, because the texture of it, the individual experience of it on both sides, the specific human cost of each of the 256 separate moments of lethal contact, dissolves into aggregate statistics the moment someone tries to describe the whole of it rather than any part of it. And this is perhaps the most important thing to understand about the week of May 21 to 28, 2026, which is that the numbers describing it are accurate and the numbers describing it are completely inadequate simultaneously, and that this gap between the accuracy and the inadequacy of the description is not a failure of reporting, but a feature of the reality being described, which is the reality of three simultaneous conflicts at the edge of catastrophe, managed by fallible people with imperfect information and finite resources, in a world where the old stabilizing architecture is under stress and the new stabilizing architecture has not yet been built. The week ended not with resolution, but with continuation. Ukraine continued fighting on the Pokrovsk axis, where Russian pressure remained intense, and Ukrainian advances in Sumy and Borova and western Zaporizhia remained measured in hundreds of meters. The Strait of Hormuz remained effectively closed for most commercial shipping, while U.S. and Iranian negotiators in Doha continued working towards a framework that both sides described as close, but neither side had yet signed. The India-Pakistan ceasefire continued holding, with the specific and uneasy quality that a ceasefire holds when both sides would prefer not to restart the fight, but have not resolved any of the underlying conditions that started it. And in the Pacific and in a dozen other theaters of smaller conflicts and larger tensions, the week's accumulation of actions and responses and signals and countersignals continued, adding to the strategic record that future historians will read when they try to explain how the world arrived at whatever came next. Whatever came next had not yet arrived, but it was visible on the horizon, in the radar returns and the sonar pings and the drone feeds and the satellite imagery and the diplomatic cable traffic of a week that the world's most consequential military actors spent entirely in the posture they had occupied for months now, which was the posture of people who have not yet decided to go over the edge, but have not yet found a reason to step back from it, holding a position that is precisely defined by what it is between rather than what it is, which is between the world that existed before all of this started and the world that will exist when all of this is over, whenever that is, whatever that looks like, however many of the people managing these crises this week will still be alive to see it.